All right, Ashley, you should have the ability to share your screen. So as a reminder for those that are on the call, we will be monitoring chat and taking questions when applicable. So thank you again for coming today to our webinar with IHEC and hosting Ashleigh Hala with us from the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts in North Adams, Massachusetts. So for today, we're going to be talking about AOD work for, specifically with AOD prevention across the socio-ecological model and how that applies to our work. So a little bit of background on Ashleigh. She is the Associate Dean and Chief Wellness Officer, and she has done numerous jobs within promotion work for counseling, health services, health promotion, and things like that. And she has also worked in substance use and addiction services and other capacities. So we're excited to have her with us today, as she has been a returning presenter for us with IHEC. And if you have questions, like I said, please drop them in the chat and we will get started. All right, Ashleigh, it is all you.
Fantastic, fantastic. It took me a minute to figure out how to make the little floating directions go away. It's been a while since I've done a Zoom webinar, but I think we figured it out. So happy to have folks here, excited to talk about, looking at AOD prevention work through a socio-ecological lens. And so we're going to be able to look at a couple of different elements of that today and give some concrete examples of what that might actually look like. So just to kind of walk us through what our day is going to be, is we will just talk for a moment about what is prevention? What is prevention science? What are best practices? How do we ground ourselves in this conversation? We'll talk for just a minute about the social determinants of health and how that connects, and why we should understand that before we apply things to the sociological model. Then we'll orient ourselves to that model, and again, think about some different things that might be influencing substance use from a prevention lens. I'm going to give you a practical application example of an initiative that we did at Wake Forest University, and then we'll close with, well, what now? What do we do with this new information and new knowledge now that we have now that we've been sort of grounded and oriented in this way? So that'll be our time today. There is time for questions at the end, and so please, happy to sort of open this up to discussion later on. So that's sort of the plan for today. So I want to just, again, sort of start us off thinking about, okay, like when we think about prevention work, what do we mean when we say that? It's I think important for us to really center in this, because it helps guide our decision making when we think about a prevention strategy. So the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that prevention is holistic. We need to be able to understand and apply the fact that prevention exists across the dimensions of wellness, right? It's not just living in one or two. And when we think about a particular issue like substance use, we need to think about how this fits into all of these dimensions, right? We're looking at the dimensions from the World Health Organization. And, if you look at some of these examples, there are very clear connections to how substance use might play into these different categories. And so let's just pick a few for example. So certainly social, right? So maybe things about party safety and ways that we can create safe social spaces where alcohol or drugs are being used. Certainly physical health, right? Like how do substances impact our physical well-being? Intellectual or occupational, how might substance use impact our time in the classroom? How might substance use impact our ability to work, get a job, those types of things, and so on and so forth. And so really important to remember that when we are implementing a prevention strategy, think holistically, use all of these dimensions, and think about the connections. That's sort of piece number one. Piece number two is that prevention is part of a larger healthcare model. It plays into how we navigate healthcare for our students on our campuses. And so what you'll see here is one of my favorite images out there. It's the Institute of Medicine's protractor. And what this protractor does is it describes sort of the different ways in which people navigate the healthcare system. What you'll see in the white section are really more services based, right? So treatment and recovery. So those are going to be things like one-on-one therapy or maybe an appointment in your student health center, right? So case identification, meaning what's the diagnosis, standard treatment for that diagnosis, long-term treatment, and then aftercare. So it really sort of takes somebody through, hey, they show up to the health center with, a basic health concern like allergies, let's say, given where we are in the year right now. That case is identified as allergies. There's standard treatment. Maybe there's a medication that they can take every day. There's compliance with that treatment, so actually taking that medication every day, and then aftercare, meaning that we've now moved through that and we are no longer seeing symptoms there. So that's a really basic example of how the sort of white side of this kind of manifests itself. Now, you can also apply substance use to this too. So, a really great example would be, moving someone through substance use disorder therapies and being able to use diagnostics and interventions to move them through the white part of this protractor to eventually aftercare and recovery. And so that definitely fits. But now the blue side is this other kind of part of healthcare, and that is community health, population level health, right? And so there's a couple of different buckets here. So the first one that I want to talk about is universal prevention. So what that is it's a prevention initiative that is applicable to everybody in a community. So, an example might be a screening day, and a substance use related screening day that's open to the entire campus, or possibly an online course that every student is required to take around substance use, maybe before they start their first year as a student, right? These are some examples of this. Selective prevention is prevention initiatives targeted at a particular group that might be at higher risk. So we're going to talk a little bit later about how this issue impacts student athletes. We know student athletes, for example, have higher binge drinking rates than non-student athletes. So might we create a selective prevention intervention for them? Yes, absolutely. And that's a great example of how we might do that. And then there's indicated. Now, indicated is a prevention process that's targeted at a person who is at higher risk. My favorite example of this is basics. So we have this motivational interviewing based intervention that's not necessarily case identification, it's not diagnostic, but it provides this indicated way to address a particular student's substance use. And so when we think about our prevention strategy, again, we're thinking holistically around those 8 dimensions, but we should also be varying our strategy between universal, selective, and indicated prevention processes as well. And then you see promotion in the darker blue. Promotion, when we think about prevention is making bad things happen less, right? Promotion is making good things happen more. And so we think about, what things can we put in place to, make create some healthy culture around substance use on our campuses. So that's sort of how, the general healthcare system kind of works. We sort of start with how everybody in a culture might be impacted with promotion-based activities and go all the way to recovery and aftercare. And you might have one student in your campus community who walks through all of these different sort of pieces of the protractor. And so just important for us to ground and know. Now, the other piece that I want to say is that, there is some long-standing best practice around substance use prevention work. That being said, colleges and universities are also known for doing innovative and new things, right? And so when we think about different strategies that we might use to influence our students' substance use, um, I am absolutely a proponent of trying new things. I'm a risk taker. Big risk, big reward. That's definitely a part of my attitude. But our risks need to be grounded in something, right? And so this table that you see here is from an excellent article by Nation that sort of talks about what are the prevention program basics. So when we think about an effective strategy, what do those strategies have in common? So you'll see here 9 different examples. So the first is that it's comprehensive. So multi-component interventions that address critical domains that influence the development and perpetuation of the behaviors to be prevented. Then we think about varied teaching methods. So, it's not just a didactic presentation, it's not just an online course, but we're sort of being able to address these issues from multiple different angles and meeting our students where they're at. So we have people that learn in different ways. We need to teach in different ways, right? Sufficient dosage. This one I love because I often find, and I'm sure that those of you on the call can resonate with this. There are some communities that we overwhelm with programming and information, and there are some communities that go totally untouched. So, as an example, first year students, fraternity and sorority life students, athletes, because these are sort of groups of people that can be easily kind of contained, we hit them with a lot of programming and interventions. And they're higher risk groups, so that makes sense. But we're also missing people, right? We're missing other folks who may be at risk to some degree. And so finding a way to do sufficient dosage and being able to provide your interventions and prevention strategies throughout the college student's experience is going to be important. Theory driven. So our work should be based on something. There should be some type of theoretical justification. We can't just sort of make something up. Now, that being said, again, we can be creative, we can be innovative, we can sort of try something new and different, but what are we tying back to? So that's really theory driven. Positive relationships. So how are we using relationships to role model the behaviors that we're looking for and creating a positive relationship so that there is a connection for people to change behavior? And so, I would really recommend that your staff that are doing these prevention programs or interventions are out in the community. People know who they are. They've got a good reputation. They go to school events. Because of those positive relationships, we are going to see changes in behavior. And so that's really a critical one too. Appropriately timed. So what are some higher risk moments, right? I'm going to talk about an example from Wake Forest and a particular high risk moment that required a strategic prevention strategy, but I want you to think about your campus community. Where are those high risk events? Is it homecoming? Is it alumni weekend? Is it the last day of classes? What are your high risk moments? And how do we make sure that we time our interventions appropriately? It should be socioculturally relevant. And so we want to make sure that we're culturally responsive in this. We know that a lot of what we call best practices are different strategies and interventions that have been tested on white, straight, cis male students. And we need to be able to adjust and again learn and be innovative and do our homework and figure out, okay, different populations are going to respond to different interventions and prevention strategies. So where do we start? And so being able to ask that question, my tip for you on this is if you have data, so the NCHA survey, Healthy Minds, the well-being assessment, there are wishes, there are several different well-being surveys out there. Maybe your online matriculation course that your students are taking around substance use. I want you to take that data and disaggregate it. So what I mean by that is when we look at data in the aggregate, we look at data that represents the typical student, right? And the typical student tends to be an overrepresented student. And so that's where we can sort of slip up sometimes. And so when we disaggregate, we look at data based on specific communities. So we can say, our LGBTQ plus students might need a different prevention approach around substance use than our students who don't identify as LGBTQ plus, as an example. There should be an outcome evaluation in your prevention strategy. I did a talk at West Point earlier this year, and they sort of asked, what is the one recommendation you would have for folks implementing prevention strategies? And this talk was in regards to sexual violence. And my answer was assess, assess, assess. It's not going to be an effective prevention or public health program if there's not a solid evaluation attached to it. And so we can talk more about that at the end of this, but there should be something there that helps you figure out, is this even working anyway? And so that's definitely there. And then well-trained staff. We obviously need competency and competence around the work that we're doing. And so how do we support the people on the ground doing this work? And that also includes our peer educators, not just our paid full-time salaried staff, but anybody sort of doing this work out there. And so I want you to think about these principles as you sort of explore today. What strategies might we want to use as prevention approaches moving forward? So the social determinants of health are something that we should touch on before we kind of jump into the SEM directly. And so I want to just kind of ground us in this a little bit. So the social determinants of health, as defined by Health and Human Services, are the conditions in the environments where people are born, live, learn, work, play, worship, and age that affect a wide range of health functioning and quality of life outcomes and risk. And Healthy People 2030 and is breaks this down into these 5 categories that you see right here. So one is economic stability. So the ability to afford what we would call health supporting purchases. Think about food, think about housing, like those are going to be on that list. Then you see education access and quality. So the ability to obtain and maintain high quality education, right? Sort of throughout your educational journey. Then there's healthcare access and quality. So how do we provide people the opportunity to access high quality healthcare? Is that possible in our certain, maybe our locations, our geographical locations, or other things that might be challenging in that regard? Then there's the neighborhood and built environment. So the ability to live safely in the space where you spend time, in your environment, in your neighborhoods, in your cities, in your blocks, in your apartment complexes, whatever those things are. Do I feel safe and secure in those spaces? So that's an important one. And then there's the social and community context. And this is really the ability to have positive relationships with the people around us. And going back again to that Nation article, positive relationships are a protective factor that make prevention more possible. And so that's going to be really critical. And so we want to think about these different elements of the social determinants of health also as circumstantial. So they're highly influenced by the circumstances of a person's experience in life and sort of what's going on for them. Now, the difficult part of that is that it can change quickly. The positive part of that is it can change quickly, right? Based on the circumstances that we provide, particularly on a college campus, how can we influence these determinants of health to make our students healthier when they graduate than when they came in to our communities as first-year students? So just something for us to consider. Now, we've long known that substance use is driven by a complex set of factors and circumstances. And our decisions are influenced by circumstances, right? Consciously, subconsciously, it might look different for different people. But that's why substance use prevention should be comprehensive, addressing as many of the primary drivers of substance use as possible. And so many of the social determinants of health are really directly associated with the increased risk of substance use. Others are actually maybe more closely associated with things like increased rates of stress or anxiety or depression, which also are indicators for substance use. So important things to pay attention to. Things to consider, for instance, maybe there's a neighborhood with lower rates of economic stability. What we tend to see there are significantly associated increased rates of substance use among residents, right? So these are just examples of ways that these things kind of play together and ways that substance use can be directly impacted by the social determinants of health. But when you think about this, what I want you to take away from this is when we think about substance use and the social determinants of health, by addressing these social determinants in our prevention programs, prevention can better serve vulnerable populations who are more likely to engage in substance use and experience negative consequences. And so again, we're going back to this moment of being holistic. And here's just another way that we can do that. Um, so, but also this is a big issue, right? Substance use prevention is massive, and when we look at it through an SDOH lens, it almost feels even bigger, right? These are these issues that are addressed in the social determinants of health are big societal problems, and they can be really intimidating. These are, large scale issues that require large scale solutions. And prevention organizations can really focus on manageable components of the problem. So, how do we break it down? And we can use some of the tools that we've introduced. We can use the 8 dimensions of wellness, we can use the prevention protractor, we can use the prevention best practices and think about, okay, we've got this major societal issue. What are some different ways that we can look at it and ways that we can break it down into sort of smaller, more manageable pieces so that our prevention strategies can work? And again, you'll see that example in a moment with some practical application. Um, so that's sort of a baseline of thinking about, okay, how does the SDOH impact the work that we're doing with the social ecological model, which is sort of where we're going to go, next. And so this is an introduction. I'm sure this is something you've seen before, but when we think about the social ecological model, we're thinking about how somebody lives in context. And there's several different types of context, right? There's sort of the individual context or the intrapersonal context, thinking about perception of risk and self-concept, age, knowledge, attitudes, problem solving, physical health, mental health, trauma, resiliency, developmental history, all of the things that make us intrapersonally who we are, fall into that space. Then there's the interpersonal, right? So how we engage with family, friends, social groups. This could be family history associated with substance use. This could be access to peer and family support, how they use their peer group, how they socialize, and secure relationships with maybe role models or family or people like that in our lives. And so there's definitely some interpersonal pieces around substance use prevention that absolutely matter. Then there's the community focus, right? So we might be thinking about culturally responsive substance use related providers and healthcare services, health promotion and education campaigns, harm reduction programming, which is going to be a critical component of this. And again, the implementation of community-based evidence-informed practices, right? Which we've spent a little bit of time on. And then there's this sort of like societal category. And I think that that can include a couple of different things in the context of colleges and universities. Certainly, sort of public sort of policy and thinking about what's going on at our local, state, and national levels, but also this concept of institutional factors and thinking about, okay, we've got this college community. And I don't know if you think of colleges this way, but I see a lot of universities as sort of these little microcosms of the rest of the world. They're sort of this condensed version of what our students are going to find in the world once they graduate. And so they've got this little neighborhood where they live and they play and they learn, where they get their food, where they maybe seek a healthcare provider, where they meet friends, where like all of those things happen in this very like pronounced square footage of this little microcosm community. And so there's something cultural there that's going to matter, that exists within that community itself that maybe might not exist in the larger public, national, local community, right? And so important to pay attention to our particular campus cultures and how that campus culture might influence some of these conversations moving forward. Now, this is a simplified version of this, right? And it's designed to think about AOD prevention specifically. And so this really breaks it down into 3 categories. So individual, the interpersonal, again, those are our relationships, and then the macro, which is going to be those big picture items. And so they really tried to sort of make this simple for practitioners in regards to, okay, how do we think about substance use across the social ecological model in a way that feels attainable? And so they broke it down as such. Individually, we need to focus on health behaviors. And so that's going to be a lot of our health education work, right? Psychosocial factors and physiological factors. And so I imagine that when I say that, you're probably thinking about, your orientation alcohol and drug program that probably does those three things, right? It teaches about appropriate health behaviors and risks, and it talks about psychosocial factors and the ways that those might influence the way that somebody might experience substances. So things like social impacts, groupthink, tolerance, like those types of pieces, and then physiological factors. So what, if you're talking about BAC or other ways that substances might impact us, those are going to be a part of this larger initiative. So those I think we have a pretty good handle on. Interpersonal, I think, is where we're seeing a lot of growth right now. Thinking about our social structures. And I'm seeing lately a lot of really innovative and really cool interventions focused on groups and focused on social settings. And really sort of thinking about how do we create an intervention right then and there where a student is faced with making a substance use-based decision. What can we do there? So I think that's a really exciting place for us in the field. And then there's this macro category. Again, these are our big picture societal issues. And we're thinking about culture and norms. We're thinking about history, which is important for a college campus community, seeing as we have this facet of alumni that creates a legacy, on our campuses. And so history is going to be really important. And then public policy. And I might think about this also, not only as, what's going on at the State House or what kinds of things are kind of happening at the national level. But I also, when I think about culture, I like to think about our surrounding neighborhood as well. Again, going back to those social determinants of health. A great example is if you're going to create a comprehensive social, ecological, and social determinants of health based prevention model, one great partnership for your substance use folks is local restaurants and bars, right? How do you talk to folks about risky behavior or and your amnesty policy or what to do when there's a case of alcohol poisoning? We want to make sure that these communities where your students are going, we're all speaking the same language. There's a sense of nomenclature. And I think that this macro piece really helps us think about what this work looks like beyond the bounds of that campus parameter that we talked about before. So there's some different ways in which this shows up. And we didn't talk about primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, mostly because the field really is moving towards that universal, selective, and indicated. But these are some really great images that I wanted to introduce you to. So this first one, it talks about primary prevention strategies. And it talks about risks and protective factors. And so it's super concise in thinking about, okay, what are some of the things that we should be looking out for? What are those risks? What are those things that at a primary prevention level, we should be paying attention to sort of figure out, what is our current state? But then on the other side of things, what are the protective factors? What's going for us here? What do we have in our favor? And so just a couple of examples here. Adverse childhood experiences as a risk. I think that this one is so important. We are seeing higher and higher rates of students coming into college with trauma histories than we've ever seen before. And ACEs as a risk factor is well documented, well researched for many different types of health concerns, substance use, sexual violence, and more. And so, one thing that I might recommend is adding an ACEs screening to a particular maybe data tool that you use every year or something like that. That might be a great way to sort of address that risk issue. And the interpersonal, you'll see maybe lack of care of consistent caring adult during childhood and how that might influence somebody's substance use later on in life. And so again, when we think about how we meet that need, how do we role model as college and university staff and faculty to create these caring adult relationships and sort of reteach or sort of introduce our students who may have not had that experience to what that might feel like. And at the macro level, you'll see a few different examples here, but I mean, things like, I think a good example are drug laws, right? Like things that might influence us from the big picture to sort of the micro work that we do on our campuses. But we need to also lean into these protective factors. And so, you'll see here some examples on the right. And so school programs, accessible and affordable healthcare services, again, that goes back to our social determinants of health. At the interpersonal level, thinking about mitigating stress, thinking about social support, social connectedness as a protective factor, right? At the macro level, economic opportunity, resources available to people and families, right? Lots of different opportunities here. And so I love these images because I think it really distills some of this for us, and allows us to think about substance use in a more directive way. So this was the primary prevention image. They also do this for secondary and tertiary. So you'll see the secondary prevention image here. And you'll just see some examples. And so, risks being things like co-occurring mental health conditions and comorbidities. And when we see somebody with a substance use concern, what is the likelihood that there may be another mental health concern there? And how do we create sort of intervention and treatment systems as well as prevention systems that help address that, right? We see stigma and lack of affordable or accessible treatment services. So some risk factors there at the individual level. At the interpersonal level, we see stigma again. We see punitive interactions, social isolation, and more. And so lots of ways that we need to think about, particularly the relationship between providers and our students. And so those of us who are providing services, including prevention services, and our students, and how we can use those interpersonal relationships to address risk. At the macro level, again, we see stigma show up at the societal level. We see issues around treatment and things that might make treatment difficult, or at a high threshold, or things around like health insurance and those types of things. And so again, thinking about the risks there, but we've got protective factors again. So thinking about a couple of these things that you see on the screen. And so at the individual level, things like early diagnosis, things like basic needs. I can't describe to you. So one of my roles on campus is I oversee the counseling center, and I'm also a licensed therapist. And I can't tell you how many students walk into the counseling center wanting therapy that really just need food, or just need a job, or just need housing. Um, Weekly therapy is not what they need to thrive. And so this basic needs issue, particularly on college campuses, I think is a major trend that we're talking about right now, and something that we need to consider when we think about our substance use implications, right? At the interpersonal level, peer support is going to be really critical here. So when we think about our peer education programs, or maybe recovery programs that we have on our campus communities, things to think about, how can we use those as protective factors. And then at the macro level, at the secondary, in the secondary category, housing and workplace policies, socioeconomic opportunity, availability of providers, those types of things, again, are going to be those protective factors for us. And then we have the tertiary, which is the last category. And so this is gonna again look the same here. So at individual, we see internalization of stigma, we see forced withdrawal as a risk, unaddressed withdrawal symptoms as a risk. At the interpersonal level, isolation, discrimination, lack of provider knowledge, right? Like how do those things impact and create higher risk for our students? And at the macro level, again, thinking about punitive criminal or legal processes, and that could be very akin to our conduct processes. Lack of access to comprehensive health services, societal stigma, right? But we've got these protective factors to help us address them. And so being able to provide knowledge for our communities about substance misuse. And here they give a couple of examples around overdose prevention, safer injection, those types of things. But we can do this in regards to a wide variety of AOD topics. As a protective factor in the interpersonal level, maybe bystander approaches or really productive case management models could be good examples. And then at the macro level, again, thinking about things like an amnesty policy or, some of the work that we could do in campus housing. And so these are just some really great images. And I know that this session is being recorded, so you can go back and take a look at these and be able to kind of get a sense of, okay, what are some of the risks that we should be paying attention to, but what are those contrary protective factors that we can leverage and use to make our program more successful. So I want to also talk about how we can think about using the social ecological model for specific populations. And again, I want you to think about that protractor. And we had that selective prevention group, right? And this is creating interventions and prevention strategies for groups that are at higher risk. There's been some really cool work done around college athletes' alcohol consumption, in part in connection with the NCAA. And this model was created that specifically addresses the use of college, the alcohol use for college athletes. And so it starts right at the top. You see the intrapersonal, and really what they've distilled about this is there were issues around perceptions around drinking, particularly how much other people drink and how that impacts how much we believe we should drink, right? And then the beliefs around alcohol influences on health, usually a gap in thinking about, how might alcohol influence my overall physical well-being? How might it influence my ability to perform as an athlete, right? That's actually a piece of this too. At the interpersonal level, perception of teammates' alcohol patterns. Think about your first year, student athlete who's looking at the team captains at a party and seeing what they're doing and how they're behaving and how that might influence how that new student might engage with substance use, right? So that's something to consider. And then there's this concept of normative beliefs. So what do we do on the tennis team? How does that team navigate? What are some of our team values? What is our nomenclature? What do we do as a collective group? And then there are also ways that some of those normative pieces actually play into what do college athletes do? What does it mean to be a D1, D2, D3 athlete, and how it relates to an athlete's substance use? At the organizational level, we're talking about the coaches. We're talking about the leadership and structure of a team, the ways in which they're coached, and some sport pedagogy, and thinking about how the coaches influence their athletes' behavior. So that's a significant one. And I've done some work in that area. So if we want to talk about that later, I'm happy to do that. Community. So what is the general population sort of thinking and doing around substance use? And then policy, university and athletic department rules and policies around alcohol use. And I'll give you a sneak peek here. The NCAA found that the vast majority of athletic departments don't have an alcohol or substance use related policy in place. Now the universities do, right? But the athletic departments themselves, they did find that there were some sort of unwritten team rules. And so, thinking about like, you don't drink 24 hours before a meet, right? Like that's an example, but it's not a departmental policy that would live in this section of the social ecological model. So an area of growth, I think, for our field is focusing on that particular part of the social ecological model. Now, what I want to call attention to here is we can do that. I mean, this is based on research and experience, but we can sketch out a social ecological model for any population we want. I mean, we should think about things like focus groups. We should think about things like finding the evidence out there that people have already kind of looked into or researched and pulling it into what we create here. But it makes total sense to take a high risk population and think about it in this way. And so this can be replicated, is something that I want to share. So I want to just show you an example of what this might look like. So I want to talk to you about an event, a yearly event that happens at the last college that I worked at. What the event is called Senior Fifth. And what it is when you are a senior, at the last football home game of the year in your senior year, the challenge is to drink a fifth of alcohol from 12:01 in the morning until kickoff. Um, as I can't see any of you right now, but like I imagine you're sort of making a face of like, that sounds dangerous. Absolutely is. And again, we talked earlier about interventions being appropriately timed. This was a high risk moment for us that we had to respond to. We had to show up. And so there's this program, there's this what's the word I want? There's this tradition is the word I want around Senior Fifth. And so how do we show up to that? Well, we use the social ecological model, and we hit this from many, many different perspectives. And so you'll see here all of these varieties of things that we would do in the months before this event um, that would help us mitigate risk. And so you'll see, I think, some really good examples here, like, making sure that our policy is revised every year and that, that it feels relevant, it feels appropriate, including our amnesty work. Sequenced AOD training, again, sufficient dosage, right? We talked about that a little bit earlier. Poster campaigns we would do every single year around social norming and introducing our community to social norming strategy. We offered food reimbursements to groups like Greek organizations so that if they were hosting like a space where people were drinking, they could make sure we could make sure they had food and water. We would meet with student leaders. We would put our information in a variety of newsletters and spaces and places where students might gather information. We would think about ways in which alcohol was being sort of controlled and given out, and creating some approaches for that. We would think about things like training, like tips training, as an example. We would talk to our public safety folks around community policing strategy as it relates to something like Senior Fifth and how our students might be showing up to that home football game, right? But we'd also be talking to them about, what security might look like that day and how we might want to sort of change our approach for an event like this. Again, food and water being provided. We did some work around food swipes and people being able to access food more easily and at a cheaper rate than maybe not. And we really tried to make sure that some of those harm reduction strategies were there. And so I know that this seems like a lot, but these are all things that mattered and make a difference. And one thing that we saw at this particular university is this really beautiful trend line of longitudinal data that showed that our hospitalizations and transports were consistently going down significantly each year. And they continued to go down as we added more things to this list. And so something for you to consider as an example when we think about, okay, what does all this mean and what could it actually look like? And this is just one way that this work can be done. But I want you to think about, what is my Senior Fifth? What is my moment on my campus that would require this kind of sort of approach or thought, and think about mapping it out. I think that there's some high value in that, and so just an example that I wanted to throw your way. So what can you do today? What you can do today, I want you to feel like you can take, something really productive away from this. And I think, my recommendation for you is to do a couple of things. One is to audit your current prevention programs. and to think about what are we doing and is it working? Is it addressing the different types of prevention? Is it addressing best practices in prevention? Are we thinking about the social determinants of health? How does this strategy exist in the social ecological model? Think about and how does the strategy fit into a larger portfolio? So maybe you take a look at all of the substance use prevention programs that you have on your campus, and maybe they all fall into that health behavior category. Well, we need to do some work in the relationships and the community categories at that point, but we know, right? And so I want you to kind of think about what's an audit, what's a way that I could sort of take a pulse on the work that we're doing now. And then I want you to think about the ideal state. So where do we want to go? What would a successful program look like? What would our outcomes be if we implemented a successful prevention program? Our campus would look like what? Our students would behave in what way? Our percentages of XYZ would be this, right? And I want you to think about the ideal state, and then I want you to use these tools to work backwards from there. How do we get there using these different pieces and things to help us inform what we're doing? And I think that it'll create a roadmap for you to be able to say, hey, we've got this big problem. And again, how do we chunk it out into more manageable pieces and make it possible for us to move forward? And I think that as a prevention strategist, that's a really critical piece of this, is to not get super overwhelmed by some of the large scale kind of implications of these issues, but rather being able to say, okay, going back to this, being able to say, all right, let's chunk this out. Let's talk about food. Let's talk about water. Let's talk about security. Let's talk about communications. Let's talk about social norms. We're chunking it out into things that are totally manageable. And then when we put it all together like this, it's incredibly effective. So just some things that you can do today. So I'll open it up for Q&A. I'll put my information here as well. I absolutely welcome connections, spaces to share knowledge, to brainstorm together, to provide feedback. I love growing my network. And so if this interests you, if you want to sort of talk through prevention strategy, if this kind of piqued your interest, I mean, I love being able to jump on a Zoom call with folks and talk about this stuff. This is the stuff that makes work exciting. And so this is my information. This is how you can get a hold of me. And so again, this is being recorded, so you should be able to grab this if and when you need it. But I wanted to make sure that we had a way to connect after this, because I would love to continue the conversation. So I just talked a lot. What I want to do now is open it up to the room and see what folks are thinking. So let me figure out how to get you back. Let's see. Can you still see my screen? Okay. My little things are not coming up.
I was gonna say, I've not seen anything in the chat, so.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you
Well,
for all that wonderful information and given the breakdown.
yeah. Happy to do it. Happy to do it. I don't know why I can't get
Oh,
out of the
good.
screen. I'm that person in the office who can't figure out how to print, and so this is like high level for me. So
Good.
anything I can do for anyone on the call?
This time, we will keep you posted, and we're gonna promote I'm sure a lot of people are gonna hop on the one on the 13th. Let's see. How many do we- Yeah, we got a ton of people registered for that one. I think just Memorial Day weekend, a lot of people are out this week is what I found, so.
Oh, no worries. No worries.
I
And
figured I'll tell them like, hey, check this one out before you hop on the second one, and then we can have a better conversation, so.
yeah, sounds good. Sounds awesome. All right, cool. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.